What kind of customer can be a flexible load that can buy power from a grid when it's available, but then when there's demand elsewhere can shut off? And the answer is Bitcoin mining.
Do you think eventually it might make sense to diversify your Bitcoin holdings into these TradFi institutions?
No question. Absolutely it does, and we will.
This episode is brought to you by Trezor. Trezor makes beautifully crafted hardware wallets that allow you to easily and safely store your crypto assets. Trezor's been in the game for a very long time. Since 2013, they were the pioneers of hardware wallets and the seed phrase setup, and their hardware wallets are open source. In fact, my favorite is the Trezor Safe 5. It's a beautifully designed and easy to use hardware wallet, guys, and it's my go-to. And they support a variety of coins. All your top crypto tokens, your Bitcoins, your XRP, Ethereum, Solana, and much more. And even new coins, even BlackRock's BITL token. So they support coins on the institutional side where you have tokenization of different assets and much more. And they even offer a great service that helps you to get your Trezor device set up. You get one-on-one customer support from their team. So you can check that out as well. So once again, I'm a big fan of this hardware wallet. So if you'd like to learn more, visit the link in the description. Hey folks, welcome into the Thinking Crypto podcast. I'm your host, Tony Edward, and joining me today is Matt Schultz, who is the co-founder, executive chairman, and CEO of CleanSpark. Now, CleanSpark is one of the largest and most recognizable Bitcoin mining companies in North America. Matt, it is great to have you.
Tony, thanks for putting this together. It's fun to be here.
Absolutely, Matt. I think it's great timing to be chatting about Bitcoin mining and where we're at in the cycle. And, there's a lot happening with the governments looking to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. You were part of some of the meetings, so I have a lot of questions for you, but I would love to kick it off with your background. Tell us about where you're from, what's your professional background, and how did you discover Bitcoin?
Got it. Yeah, thank you. So, small town boy. I grew up in a little town called Lander, Wyoming. About 5,000 people that lived there. So tiny graduating class. And it was a terrific place to grow up. If you wanted to play a sport, you played a sport. There weren't tryouts. We just didn't have enough warm bodies. So it was a lot of fun. My background, I've always been on the finance side, focused on energy and a number of different endeavors. And how I came to find Bitcoin is a bit of a convoluted story, but it's kind of interesting. I was involved in the traditional energy space, oil and gas, and putting together project finance. And as a father, I was fortunate to have 6 kids, and some of these oil and gas properties that we bought had been poorly maintained. There was poor containment on wastewater handling. There were a number of issues, and I recognized that we were doing a pretty bad job as far as stewardship of the planet. So I made a pivot in my career to start focusing on more alternative sources of power, renewable energy. We had some, as we worked over and improved some of these projects, the wastewater handling trucks that we operated had a big logo on the back, and it said, "We didn't inherit the planet from our parents. We've borrowed it from our children." So kind of gave me the drive to do better. And so we developed a portfolio of technology regarding energy generation and the conversion of carbonaceous feedstock into a clean syngas. So convert waste to energy. And then we were deploying those solutions in a number of different applications, and we ended up partnering with and then subsequently acquiring a microgrid technology company. So we were building, you think about the US energy grid as the macro grid. Well, microgrid would be a campus-based or a smaller version of that grid. So you have energy generation, distribution, controls, and storage. So we were building mission critical microgrids at places like Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton and at embassies around the world. And then we started to deploy those solutions in data centers, and we could model those solutions around a number of different vectors. So cost avoidance, resiliency, or greenhouse gas avoidance. And so, at the military bases, the mission was to make sure that navigation, guidance, and communications always stayed live regardless of what was going on with the San Diego gas and electric grid. So through that process, we then developed a communications protocol. So if you, in the state of California, as an example, if you produce solar at your facility, there are opportunities to push some of that power back to the grid for revenue. It's called demand response. And so we owned the virtual top node and virtual end node communications protocol that would allow a private business to sell power back to a public utility. So through that process, we developed a really healthy understanding of the interaction with the utility grid and how delicate the balance is, because the grid has to produce enough power such that the demands are met at peak demand, but then not overbuild capacity so you're running power to ground when demand wanes. And so, understanding that there are periods of time that there's surplus power and there are periods of time that the grid is somewhat constrained, the idea behind a flexible load started to really present itself as an obvious solution to fix the grid instability and the challenges we have with the domestic power grid. In conjunction with that, we were working with the Minister of Energy in South Africa to put community-based microgrids in play to assist in areas that there were energy poverty. And the challenge was we designed and presented a solution for a half a dozen community-based microgrids, but even the World Bank wouldn't touch that without a flexible offtake. And so it prompted this spirited discussion between our leadership team and our board of directors. And that was, what kind of customer can be a flexible load that can buy power from a grid when it's available, but then when there's demand elsewhere can shut off? And the answer is it's not a traditional data center, and it's not a manufacturing facility, and it's not, any number of different applications, but what it is Bitcoin mining. So Bitcoin mining became kind of the panacea for grid stabilization and load balancing, because these machines have no memory. You can you ramp them up, ramp them down, overclock, underclock, and you can do that based on, economic conditions that are driven by, the capacity and the availability on the grid. So, we decided to focus as America's Bitcoin miner on identifying pockets of power that are underutilized. And if you think back 4 or 5 decades ago in our country, there was an abundance of manufacturing and mining and sawmills and all different types of industry that has subsequently gone offshore. So you got these little communities that many decades ago funded municipal bonds to acquire their participation in the utility grid and the generation and the distribution. And then when industry left, you got all these beautiful little communities that have pockets of power that are underserved, that, there's an opportunity that a company like us can go in. We can buy that power from the local utility, which in most instances is the city, and they can make a margin on that power. And so it makes a difference in those communities. And then we also bring high-tech jobs. So we like to tell the story, as a father, one of my kids' favorite movies growing up was the movie Cars. And it's a story about that little town, Radiator Springs, that was this bustling, happening metropolis until the freeway came by, and then that town was forgotten. And that's kind of the way that we look at our community partners. Many of these are, the real world version of Radiator Springs. And so that's kind of my long answer to my Bitcoin story and how we got there. But what it's resulted in is a tremendous partnership with 33 small towns across the United States, where we're securing the global blockchain. We're creating high-paying jobs. We're pushing revenues and profits back to these small towns.
That's amazing. So you essentially started as an energy infrastructure company, is that right? And working with folks and providing new ways of getting clean energy, and then branched out into Bitcoin mining.
That's exactly right. We have a portfolio of intellectual property surrounding energy generation, distribution, and controls. And so, our patent portfolio regarding these microgrid solutions and islanding away from the grid and working in concert with the grid, and revenue generation and demand response. It's really fundamental in our DNA. And so I think we approached the Bitcoin mining industry from an entirely different perspective than everybody else. In fact, when we acquired our second facility in Norcross, Georgia, Axios sent a journalist out to kind of talk about what we were doing. And at the time, Axios was, kind of lukewarm on Bitcoin.
Sure.
And the journalist wrote in his article that CleanSpark is not a team of Bitcoin bros trying to understand energy markets. Rather, it's a team of energy professionals iterating in the Bitcoin mining landscape. And so it was a contrast and a differentiation. And I think it served us very well.
Oh, absolutely. And, there's still that stigma out there around Bitcoin mining. I just this past weekend, I was at a book festival selling my book about crypto, and someone walked by and said, "This is, Bitcoin is bad for the environment and it's using tons of energy." And I'm like, maybe in the early days, certain energy sources were used that were not great, but it's very different now. The miners are working with the grid and the governments. It's very different in 2025.
No question about it. We built a facility. It's over 200 megawatts in a little town called Sandersville, Georgia. And Georgia was, previously the textile manufacturing capital of the world. So a lot of these small towns, I mean, there was kaolin mining, there were timber mills, and there was a lot of textile manufacturing. And they had surplus power. And in Georgia, just give you a quick example. They when Southern Company went through bankruptcy decades ago, 49 small towns in Georgia formed a co-op, and they partnered up and created MEAG, which is the Municipal Electricity Authority of Georgia. And they funded through municipal bonds a stake in Plant Vogtle, which is the largest nuclear power plant deployment in this country in the last 30 years.
Mm.
And so these towns now own some of the generation, and the cities through this co-op become the utility. So they've got power available, but nobody buying it. So CleanSpark goes in and we negotiate. We buy the power from the generation at cost, and then we allow them a small margin on every kilowatt hour of power. In this particular application, it's primarily nuclear power. So it also kind of supports our mission of identifying, supporting non-carbon emitting sources of power. And that was really key early on. And it's evolved a bit to be more about grid stabilization and decreasing the reliance on coal-fired peaker plants rather than, overemphasizing the single load. But anyway, the city is now our utility. So they're able to buy much more power. And in buying more power, it's the Costco effect. So it decreases the utility cost for all the ratepayers in the jurisdiction. They then make a margin on every kilowatt hour we buy, which is millions of dollars. And as a component of the Territorial Act in Georgia, those dollars are reallocated back to the community for, bike paths and splash pads and schools and infrastructure. Well, then on top of that, we pay sales tax. And the sales tax on the utility is designated to stay in the jurisdiction it was generated. So in this small town, Sandersville, Georgia, there was an interview that was on WSB TV in Atlanta. And the mayor had talked about the fact that in 40 years in public service, the city had never operated outside of a deficit until CleanSpark was there. Now, not only was the city in the green, but that the surplus sales tax had created a burden that they had to redistribute that sales tax somewhere else. So they reallocated it to property taxes in the community. So not only are we monetizing stranded power for the city, we're now also decreasing the cost per kilowatt hour for the ratepayers. And then the sales tax is decreasing the property tax exposure. So it becomes a win-win-win all the way along for these communities. And all the while we're incentivizing new renewable and clean energy generation.
That's profound. And I think a message like this, a story like this needs to get out there because a lot of people have the old perception and the fact that you can monetize excess energy or energy that would have been wasted or blown off or whatever it may be. and monetize it in Bitcoin mining is a great opportunity. And then, you as a mining company being able to support a local community in this way is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's, these opportunities are abundant, and it's interesting because, to your point, a lot of people saw Bitcoin mining as the evil empire, or, the New York Times article, for example, where they wrote the story that Bitcoin mining consumes more water than the top 3 major metropolitan cities in the United States. Well, that if you consider that the water that flows through a hydroelectric dam is consumed, then that would be true. But in reality, the water doesn't disappear. It spins a turbine. It's not consumed. It's not used. It's not polluted. This is hydroelectric power generation. So, the media had an agenda, and certainly don't want to let the facts get in the way of a good story. So, you create these narratives about how bad Bitcoin is and how harmful it is for the environment and the emissions that these computers put off, none of which are true. So, we work in partnership with the grid. We can build out faster than our colleagues in high performance compute. So, Cheyenne, Wyoming, for example, CleanSpark has 100 megawatts there. And the other bidder for that power was Microsoft. I mean, they're driver 9-iron away from our facility. And we prevailed, not because CleanSpark's a better credit risk than Microsoft, but because to build a proper HPC AI data center that Microsoft had spec'd, it's a 4 to 5 year endeavor. We were able to take that same property and monetize those megawatts for the benefit of the community and the utility in less than 6 months. The beauty in that process is it's duplicatable. We can run in, monetize the power, support the blockchain, build a Bitcoin mining facility. And in that particular instance, it's a fully modular, immersion cooled deployment. So ultra high efficiency, less sound emission than an air-cooled facility, and completely modular and portable. So we go in, bring in the electrical infrastructure, put in helical piers, mount the pods, fill the tanks, put the machines in, and we start hashing. And then we can start building a proper data center behind that. So when that data center is complete over the next 3-4 years, we can then pivot those megawatts to high performance compute. We can take that Bitcoin mining deployment and duplicate that again in another location. So we're building ahead of AI to stabilize the demand curve. In fact, about 18 months ago, I was invited to go to Mar-a-Lago, and this was when President Trump was candidate Trump.
Mm.
And he asked a half a dozen Bitcoin miners to join him in a roundtable. And he talked about the fact he had previously not been an advocate for Bitcoin and for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
But what he understood is there's a demographic of a voter base that are very passionate about Bitcoin, and maybe he didn't have all the proper information. So we worked with their campaign to help kind of line out their digital currency plan, I guess, so to speak.
Sure.
And in that meeting, we talked about how fast we could deploy and how we would enable. We're kind of plowing the road for AI and HPC. And he grabbed his assistant and he said, "Is Bill still here?" And she said, "I think he is." And she said, "Go grab him." So, 30 seconds later, in walks Senator Haggerty from Tennessee. And, Tennessee TVA, the largest federally owned public utility, sits down at the table, and President Trump said, "Bill, is it correct that what these guys are telling me, that Bitcoin mining actually stabilizes the grid and it shaves the peaks and the valleys, and it's a load balancing tool, but it also paves the way for AI?" And he said, "It absolutely is." And he talked about, CleanSpark specific operations within Tennessee. And so to have played a role in guiding the digital asset kind of strategy for the administration and to change the narrative for Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining has been a huge honor for myself and our team here at CleanSpark, to be able to kind of evangelize how valuable Bitcoin mining is. And then, to take it to another level, when the Russia-Ukraine war started, we used OFAC sanctions to kind of shut down Russia's access to global financial networks. Well, when we met with the Biden administration and we talked about the value of Bitcoin mining, their feedback was, "We don't want Bitcoin mining. We don't want it anywhere in the United States. We want it out of here." Well, the challenge becomes what happens when there's no block space for companies like Michael Saylor's or US investors that maybe have a Bitcoin on Coinbase. What happens if there's kind of a reverse OFAC impact and you can't access block space to buy, sell, transfer Bitcoin? So we look at Bitcoin mining domestically, and now the president and many members of Congress agree Bitcoin miners, domestic Bitcoin miners, are really a national security thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure. And obviously, the United States, President Trump signed an executive order to establish a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The first phase is, using the Bitcoin they've confiscated over the years from bad actors and so forth. But I saw you were at a meeting recently with Michael Saylor and other industry leaders to try to explore how the United States can now purchase Bitcoin. Tell us about that meeting and what were some of the takeaways for you?
It was really awesome. I mean, we spent a week in New York and then a part of the week in DC and then later that same week in Nashville. And in all of those different cities, for example, I got to spend a great deal of time on September 10th with President Bush.
Mm.
And to have him recap what was going on that morning in Sarasota when he was reading to those students and what happened when the towers were attacked and when so to have that interaction, you know, it's a kind of a pinch me moment to go from, here you are as America's Bitcoin miner, which in a prior administration is a completely villainized concept, to now having an opportunity to sit with the former president of the United States and the current president of the United States and to talk about what our industry means for the nation. And so that was a blessing. And then we went to Washington D.C. and there were a number of meetings. Um, we had an opportunity to speak to French Hill, to Tom Cotton, to Mike Johnson hosted the meeting. Very gracious guy. I first got to know Mike Johnson at the Crypto Ball during the inauguration, and the cool thing about all of these relationships is that they genuinely care about and are interested in Bitcoin and compute and how that becomes something that strengthens the US energy policy, but also the adoption of Bitcoin in the strategic reserve. So that was a separate meeting. The picture that we posted on Twitter, where with I was next to Tom Lee from Fundstrat, and then Saylor was there. We actually had the opportunity to speak to a number of representatives and senators, and Bernie Moreno was there, and Marsha Blackburn was there, and there were a number of very vocal proponents of Bitcoin in attendance at the meeting. And Senator Moreno, I think Bitcoin got Bernie Moreno elected. I mean, the Bitcoin voter project and Bitcoin voters in general put a lot of resources behind Bernie Moreno's campaign, and he has done just a phenomenal job in being an advocate for us there. And he made a statement in this session, and this isn't something that's introduced as policy, and it's not pending a vote, but just his assessment. And Michael Saylor made a statement about Seward's folly and about how the United States has made decisions acquiring Alaska or Texas or whatever the case may be that were, not well received, and everybody thought we were silly to do these things. And in retrospect, the what's created the amazing country that we call home today were these decisions. And he said Bitcoin is that next decision gate.
Mm.
And Senator Moreno in that meeting said, the challenge, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, the challenge that I have is that, since 1971, our currency has been decoupled from gold. And the gold that we own is in Fort Knox, but nobody really knows what's there.
Yeah.
And Senator Moreno, to his credit, said, with Bitcoin, the entire network is audited publicly every 10 minutes.
Yep.
So he said I could walk in Fort Knox and I could tour it, but I have no idea about the purity of the gold. I have no idea which gold is what and what the value of it is. It's all held there at $44.22 an ounce. He suggested that they revalue the portfolio of gold, hypothetically speaking, sell a percentage of the gold in Fort Knox and replace that with Bitcoin. And that was something that was literally spoken out loud in this session. So to know that there are some real strategic thinkers that are looking to find a way, because I think what we're starting to recognize is that the United States is falling behind.
Mm.
When you look at the nations around the world that have created strategic reserves that are actively buying Bitcoin, the United States is on its back foot. And while we have a strategic reserve based on seizures, one of the things that some of the members of Congress said to us was there are a lot of entities that when they seize assets as a result of nefarious activity, those assets are then sold to fund those organizations. And so to say that, we're going to take all the Bitcoin that we seize and put it in the reserve takes away from the budgets of a lot of these places, a lot of these agencies that are fighting bad actors. So there's this sensitivity to make sure that we accomplish the right goal. And so to have the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with the whip and with the Speaker of the House and with, I had an opportunity 2 days after we were in DC. There was the Imagine If conference that was hosted by Bitcoin Park in Nashville, and we got to launch the conference. And I had the privilege of opening the conference on stage with Senator Blackburn, and we talked about first principles, and we talked about Bitcoin, and we talked about energy, and we talked about the things that matter in this country, and how Bitcoin is really this patriotic American libertarian concept that really empowers people. We're no longer holding on to a devalued currency that, we teach our kids to save 10% of everything. And at the end of the day, that's bad advice because we're out printing any potential gains that they could be saving.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's great to hear those conversations are happening with some of the folks you mentioned. I've interviewed some of those folks and had conversations, and hopefully, the United States can get this figured out soon. Whether it's tariff revenue, whether it's with the gold, some of the gold supply being sold for Bitcoin. Hopefully, we can get that going soon.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's a very exciting time to be in this space.
Mm.
And what we're seeing now is many of our peers have left Bitcoin mining and they're focusing more on high performance compute. And a lot of these companies, took the approach of asset light. When they got into Bitcoin mining, they just wanted to rent rack space and throw miners in. And we took a counter-cyclical, the kind of the inverse approach where we went infrastructure first. We bought land, we built buildings, we signed power contracts. Now we have well over a gigawatt of power that we currently operate in 33 different locations in 4 states. We're about to expand in another state. We'll be talking about that in the news in the next couple of weeks. But we have a pipeline of about 1.7 gigawatts behind that. So in this race for AI and HPC compute, the most valuable commodity there is land and power. So we've generated relationships based on keeping our promises with these communities. We go in, we build quickly, we use local trades, we employ local folks, we have high performing, high paying jobs, and we can then rotate that into higher value compute and then duplicate those Bitcoin efforts. So we see Bitcoin as a catalyst to build out our compute portfolio. And we've been so fortunate that we've amassed a portfolio of critical IT capability that literally nobody else has. I mean, major 100 megawatts in metropolitan Atlanta, Georgia, and massive infrastructure in Tennessee and in Mississippi and in Wyoming. Literally, like I said, driver 9 iron away from Microsoft. And we've amassed this portfolio of incredible assets. And now what we're starting to do is build the team of people and develop the relationships that we can use that allowed us to become the best in class Bitcoin miner in the world, and then apply that now to other types of compute to maximize the value of those megawatts for the benefit of the community and for shareholders.
Talk to us a bit about your Bitcoin mining output. So, how many Bitcoin you're mining, let's say, per month? And I know that can fluctuate based on different factors. But
Sure.
also, are you holding Bitcoin on your balance sheet and things like that?
Great question. We we've averaged between 600 and 700 Bitcoin a month for the last several months. I think 2013 Bitcoin over the most recent 3-month disclosure. Um, Interesting to note that in our most recent quarter financials, we talked about the fact that we were able to mine Bitcoin at a 54% gross margin. So while the Bitcoin treasury companies are kind of aping into Bitcoin at 110,000 a coin, we're mining it at, less than half of that. So, and yes, we do have a significant Bitcoin treasury. In fact, if you go to bitcointreasuries.net, we're in the top 10 biggest in the world. We hold 13,000 Bitcoin. What's important to note is that we mined all of those. So having mined all of those, we have significant gains on those Bitcoin. So if we were to sell them, there would be a tax impact, and the tax impact, those lost sats will be something we'll never get back because of the taxes. So what we've chosen to do is we've got an institutional grade Bitcoin treasury desk. We call it our digital asset management team, led by our CFO and president, Gary Vecchiarelli and Rory Murray. And these guys have created strategies whereby we are writing derivative instruments, very low risk against the assets that we have on our balance sheet. So 13,000 Bitcoin approximately. I mean, we're talking $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin. Now we can write short dated covered calls. So say, for example, an important disclosure in our industry, a lot of Bitcoin miners, in fact, all of them except us, have an ATM, which is an at the market offering where they can sell stock to fund their operations every day.
Right.
Now, in CleanSpark's case, once we hit critical mass on our Bitcoin treasury, we went away from 100% HODL and we stopped using equity. We've not sold a single share of equity since November of last year, not one share. We wanted to preserve shareholder value and the value of our equity during this kind of volatility phase of Bitcoin mining. As global hash rate has gone up, difficulty has gone up, there's been volatility. There was a huge tailwind leading up to the election and then a bit of a fall off. So what we decided to do a number of months ago is we're going to sell a portion of our production in that current month to fund our operations. So we cover all of our OpEx by the sale of Bitcoin, and then the surplus we stack on our balance sheet. So now we've got 13,000 Bitcoin. And the beauty of that is we're making 7 figures a month return on the yield on the Bitcoin that we have, and we're selling enough to cover all of our OpEx. So we're cash flowing the growth, the acquisition of new land, infrastructure, substation builds, equipment, et cetera, through the cash flows generated from being best in class Bitcoin miner. So it's the best of both worlds. And to that end, if we know we're going to sell Bitcoin in order to sell some of the new production in order to pay our OpEx, then what we're doing is we're writing short-term covered calls, 5-day, 7-day, 10-day. And in exchange for writing those calls, we generate a premium. So those premiums stay with CleanSpark. If Bitcoin goes up and the Bitcoin gets called away, we were going to sell it anyway. If it doesn't, we still scrape the premiums off, and then we can go back in and do market-based orders when it makes sense. So we're managing this for the benefit of our shareholders, and we're now exploring using that digital asset management function as kind of leverage, if you will. We put up 2 new announcements, one just this morning with 2 Prime, one a couple of days ago with Coinbase.
Yeah.
And so it's $200 million in low single digit interest rates that allow us to borrow against that Bitcoin on a revolver. So when an opportunity comes up, I can go get $100 million today, backed by my Bitcoin. I can deploy that capital right now for whatever the use case is. And then we can use the production to pay down that Bitcoin line of credit, and we can avoid equity dilution until it makes more sense. So it's really strategic for us. We're not idealistic about Bitcoin, but we do understand and recognize that, Bitcoin is the perfect, decentralized hard cap, non-sovereign money. And it's really the value protection for the future. And so, to be able to pull on both of those strings, I mean, a lot of our peers sell all of their Bitcoin, so they have no exposure to Bitcoin. They don't have that certainty, and they're heavily reliant on debt and equity dilution, which we've done neither. So we like our strategy. We've fallen behind the market because people kind of grew a bit weary about, you're mining 700 Bitcoin a month, we can kind of extrapolate what that value is going to be. And so the only speculative nature on your stock is, does Bitcoin go up or not? Now, by monetizing megawatts through other types of compute, we're creating greater value for communities that maybe have a higher cost basis of their power. And it doesn't make sense to mine Bitcoin, but it makes perfect sense to use for high performance compute. We have those relationships. Nobody else does. And so to have that opportunity and pair that with, again, and I'm going to beat this until I can't, we absolutely have the best in class Bitcoin mining in the world. We have the best teams, the highest uptime, the greatest efficiency, the lowest cost per exahash of anybody in the space. And we've been very disciplined, and we've kind of, we were forgotten about a little bit in the space because we weren't chasing shiny keys. Mara talked about buying a wind farm and mining Caspa and, shrimp farming. And, Riot was trying to buy bit farms, and, they were making a hostile run at them and trying to figure out what they're doing with megawatts. And, Iris Energy, Iron sold all of their Bitcoin. Now they're focusing exclusively on HPC, which has worked out really well. What we've done is we've just slow and steady and in a very disciplined capacity. We've built this network and these relationships, the land and power that will allow us to be the best in class at Bitcoin, at high performance compute, just like we were at Bitcoin. And just as a last reminder on my long-winded thought, when we entered the Bitcoin mining space in December of 2020, was on a panel, and one of the peers from a major company talked about the fact that we were too late to the party. Well, now here we are, and we're the most efficient. We have more hash rate inside the United States than anybody else. And so we like the last mover advantage, because the folks that have sold out leases on HPC for whatever the revenue number was on the GPU rentals on Hoppers are now stressing that had they invested in Blackwells and built their own cloud, the returns would have been 10x from where it was. And Fox Business News came out this morning, and they did a story. There was an analyst on there that talked about CleanSpark and put a $57 price target on our stock because he likes the strategy, how we're using the extra megawatts beyond Bitcoin mining to support HPC and AI.
Matt, I want to get your thoughts on the future of Bitcoin mining because you mentioned like the hash rate's at an all-time high, the difficulty is increasing. There's so much demand for Bitcoin from countries, Wall Street, and it's happening across the globe. So how are you and the team there preparing for the future? I know you mentioned like AI and so forth, but what does Bitcoin mining look in 2030, 2040 and things like that?
So when we entered the space in 2020, the average fleet efficiency on the global network was 34 joules per terahash. So 34 watts of energy consumption to process 1 terahash of data on the network. That efficiency has come down. In fact, we are sitting on 6 exahash of the new latest, greatest generation Bitcoin miners that are 13.5 joules per terahash. So 3 times more efficient than what existed just back then. So what I see for the future of Bitcoin is a closer relationship with the chip supply chain, focusing on efficiencies, deeper integration into power systems as a load balancing entity. In fact, maybe even partnering with utilities, whereby you take, some of our proprietary technology and plant that behind the fence at a power plant and have it automatically deploy power to Bitcoin mining when there's surplus power, and then have the utility curtail it away. I mean, this is theoretical, but can you imagine a world where you take a 6 megawatt container and put it behind the fence at a utility, and the utility then provides power free? Bitcoin miner provides the systems and infrastructure as their contribution, and every single day, the mining pool settles both with the utility and the miner to pay for that transaction, to give their pro rata share of that. I believe that's my vision of the future. I think it's much more closely aligned as a load balancing entity, and a focus on efficiency. And coming out of the microgrid business, it was all about peak shaving, load balancing, identifying areas of efficiency. And that's core in our DNA. And our team, led by Scott Garrison, Taylor Monig, and their teams, are really the best in the world.
Now, there's a lot of talks about quantum computing. Now, I think if quantum computing is a threat to anything, it's the traditional world. We're going to have bigger problems than having to worry about Bitcoin. But nevertheless, there's talks about could quantum computing be used to attack Bitcoin miners or hack the blockchain, right, and break the cryptographic algorithm. But I'm assuming that along the lines, as quantum computing technology is coming out, the mining rigs will be upgraded with quantum tech. What is your take on that?
I believe that to be true. I think that, let's be honest, quantum computing right now is still a science experiment. And if and when it becomes more prevalent, I think it impacts a multitude of industries first when it's demonstrated at scale. I also think it'll impact wallets long before it impacts miners and the proof of work process. So I don't see that as a risk, but what I can tell you is that as CleanSpark has expanded our footprint in the space, I guess I can talk about it here. It's not a necessarily material non-public, but CleanSpark is working with some of our partners at Bitcoin Park to support and actually add to core dev in support of the Bitcoin core development. So I think that the core dev, they have a range of proposals designed to mitigate risk, but I think trying to break the network is probably way down the list of fears beyond the nuclear codes.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and then along the lines of there's so much demand for Bitcoin, we've seen this incredible growth. Bitcoin obviously trading over $100,000 now. And um, what are your thoughts on the cycle? Do you have a prediction for this cycle that you can share? Is the 4-year cycle broken? What are your thoughts on all that?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that. I had an opportunity to talk about that in Washington D.C. and the IBIT ETF reached $50 billion in AUM. I'm probably wrong here, and I stand to correction, but I think it was 44 days or some crazy figure, right? The next fastest was a year and a half. So the demand for exposure to Bitcoin is really at an all-time high. Bitcoin miners have known this for a long time. The rest of the world is just figuring it out. I think market access grows as other products become available. And so with the demand for Bitcoin outpacing supply, I think the cycle is broken. I mean, I read an article that Cash App buys almost the full daily production of Bitcoin just through Cash App, and they've grown their Bitcoin business. Jack Dorsey, or Mr. Nakamoto, however you want to refer to him. I think in our conversations we had an opportunity to spend some time with them at the proto launch event for their new Bitcoin mining rig in North Georgia. And I think there's a real risk and a real fear that losing domestic access to Bitcoin is problematic. And so I think you're going to see a more concerted effort to support Bitcoin and not vilify it. And so given all those reasons, I really believe that the 4-year cycle isn't expanded to a 5-year cycle. I think it's broken. And that, my basis for that little redneck, Wyoming kid is I do still remember the first day of Econ 101 and supply versus demand. And if you're producing 450 Bitcoin a day and the demand is an order of magnitude greater than that, I don't know how you start to see the price slip away.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And then from a security standpoint, you mentioned earlier Bitcoin being a national security issue, right? And the United States needs to be more in the driver's seat here. As more companies and countries and jurisdictions adopt Bitcoin and they're buying, eventually people are going to want to steal as much Bitcoin as they can. And yes, it's on the blockchain, but still, you never know what bad actors can do. How are you securing the Bitcoin that you're mining?
So as a publicly traded company, and like many of our peers, you have to have internal controls that certify or assert the certainty of the treasury. So counterparty risk has mitigated largely by Coinbase. So we have a trading wallet, we have a hot wallet, and then we have a cold hard wallet. And we use Coinbase as the our wallet provider for all of that, because when it comes to the ICFR stuff on our audits, there really aren't a lot of counterparties that have that certainty when you're talking a multi-billion-dollar treasury.
I'm curious to see how things, with TradFi and the banks coming in. We're hearing JP Morgan and all these folks, BNY Mellon, they want to launch custody. Do you think eventually it might make sense to diversify your Bitcoin holdings into these TradFi institutions?
No question. Absolutely, it does, and we will. But again, that it's currently consolidated just because of a lack of choice.
Sure.
Um, we mine with Foundry because they're domestic. A lot of a lot of our peers, mine still through Antpool or private white labeled versions of Antpool. You look at, I think China's probably our biggest risk on a lot of that stuff. And when in the United States, you look at Kango and Bitmain. I mean, the Nunn letter was introduced a couple of weeks ago where they suggested a CFIUS investigation be undertaken because these companies that are controlled directly or pardon me, or indirectly by the CCP, not only do they have a huge footprint in the global blockchain, but they're also making a massive impact on US infrastructure. They have hundreds and hundreds of megawatts that they control, mining to a Chinese pool, owned by the Chinese government, but mining here in the US. I think there's a lot of risk. And so I think nationalized support for what we do is going to be more critical. And listening to the way that Jamie Dimon's approach to Bitcoin and his thesis has changed over time. And to sit next to a guy like Tom Lee and to, to have spirited discussions. Mike Saylor and I sat together Monday or Tuesday night, 2 weeks ago. One of our investment banks had Sting, the performer, come in for an industry event. And Michael and I sat together. We went backstage, got to meet Sting. We both got to spend some time with President Bush, but to listen to a guy like Michael Saylor and talk about, to hear his passion for the security and safety of Bitcoin and the Bitcoin network, it only stands to reason that this massive focus on Bitcoin treasury companies is going to shift and realize that what supports and strengthens and protects Bitcoin treasury companies is the network, and that network is the miners. So I think it's a pendulum, and I think it's going to come back. And I think you take Jamie Dimon's change in philosophy now. JP Morgan Chase is going to be a custody provider. Well, I think if JP Morgan Chase can't securely hold your Bitcoin, we have a much greater problem.
Yeah, well said. Matt, absolute pleasure. I wish we had another hour to talk about Bitcoin mining and Bitcoin, but I'm going to wrap it up here. I got some wrap up questions for you. If you could create your own metaverse, what would the theme be?
Abundant nuclear power everywhere. I would, being a dad of 6 kids and coaching sports, I would have basketball tournaments as fast as and as frequent as you could. I think keeping kids busy and occupied and part of a team is really important. We need to do more to bring people together than to push them apart. And I think being a small town redneck kid, like I said, I think a return to family values, focusing on small communities, flourishing, and living our world on a Bitcoin standard would be, first place for me.
Love it. Rapid fire questions. Favorite food,
Steak.
favorite musician or band?
See, I'm really eclectic there. On my playlist, I've got Post Malone and Frank Sinatra and Noah Kahan, and there's nothing I don't like. It depends on the mood. Music moves me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm the same way. Favorite movie?
This is gonna be really unsophisticated, but Tommy Boy.
I remember that. Chris Farley and so forth. Favorite book?
I think Shackleton's Voyage.
And when you're not working at CleanSpark, what are you doing for fun?
I spend time with my family. I live in Utah. I'm in our corporate HQ in Vegas right now, which is where I office. But we're big into outdoor sports, wake surfing and boating, and all things outdoors. My kids are big golfers, so spending time with my family is priority number one.
Awesome. Matt, like I said, absolute pleasure. And I look forward, to meeting you in person someday and possibly coming out to one of CleanSpark's locations and to view all your mining operations and the things you're doing. But thank you so much for joining me.
Absolutely, Tony. It's an open invite. Anytime you want to go, you let me know. I'll meet you there.